On Christmas Eve, a tired waitress named Emma did the one thing a woman like her was never supposed to do in a room like that. She warned the most untouchable man in the city. She slipped a folded note toward the billionaire everyone feared, not because she wanted anything from him, but because she had seen something small and deliberate that didn't belong in a celebration. She didn't know his name up close, only the way people straightened their backs when he passed, the way managers held their breath as if money itself had entered the building. She didn't know that courage can be mistaken for insolence in places where kindness is treated like a weakness, and she certainly didn't know that the secret she'd noticed would reach back for her before the night was over. The luxury restaurant buzzed with low chatter and the clean clink of crystal, as if the sound alone could prove everyone inside was safe. Outside, snow fell in slow, patient layers, turning the windows into frosted paintings, while inside, the warm, golden lights wrapped everything in a polished, expensive comfort that felt almost rehearsed. Emma had expected just another long shift, smiling through sore feet, carrying plates that cost more than her monthly groceries, listening to rich people talk about life like it was a game they'd already won. But then she saw the detail that made her stomach go tight, not a dramatic gesture, not a shouted threat, but a quiet exchange in the service corridor, hands too careful, eyes too steady, a glass touched when no one was looking. It was the kind of moment that would vanish if you looked away, and Emma had spent her whole life learning what happens when people look away. What she did next wasn't about money or even fear, though fear sat heavy in her throat like a swallowed stone. It was about dignity, the kind you keep when everything else is borrowed, the kind you protect because it's the only thing that's truly yours. Emma had been overlooked so many times that invisibility had started to feel like a uniform she could never take off, and yet invisibility came with a cruel bargain. You see everything, but no one believes you saw it. Still, she thought of her mother at home, counting pennies with tired hands, and of all the times Emma had wished someone with power would simply choose decency instead of convenience. She didn't realize that this small choice, made on a night everyone else would remember only for champagne and carols, would become the moment that cracked open an empire built on silence. She approached the VIP table with the practiced calm of someone who has learned to hide storms behind a polite voice. The centerpiece glittered with red ornaments and pine, a candle flickering like a heartbeat, and Julian Hart sat beside it as if the room belonged to him by natural law. Tailored suit, steady hands, eyes that didn't soften even when people laughed. Emma set down his drink, then let the note glide beneath the edge of the plate the way she'd slid countless receipts and dessert menus, except this time her fingers trembled. The message was short, brutal, and handwritten like a confession. Get out. They'll kill you. Julian's gaze dropped, red, and froze. The glass paused halfway to his mouth, and the air between them changed temperature. Instead of rising, instead of calling for help, instead of doing anything that made sense, he reached out and seized her wrist, firm enough to stop her, controlled enough not to draw attention, as if he were collecting proof rather than touching a person. For a second, Emma heard nothing but her own breath and the distant murmur of a holiday song, and she realized she had stepped onto a line she couldn't see until her foot was already over it. Around them, laughter continued like a curtain held up by habit, and somewhere a waiter carried a tray of desserts, as if the world had not just tilted. Julian's expression didn't show gratitude or anger so much as calculation, the kind that comes from surviving rooms full of smiling knives. Then, without raising his voice, without making a scene, he gave a tiny signal toward the entrance, and the doors, softly, quietly, began to lock. Emma stood frozen with Julian Hart's fingers still around her wrist, and the strangest part was not the firmness of his grip, but the gentleness with which he kept the moment invisible. The music continued, a slow holiday melody that made everything look kinder than it was, and the people at nearby tables laughed as if laughter could protect them from noticing anything uncomfortable. Emma's pulse hammered high in her throat, and she forced her face into the calm mask she'd practiced for years, because in a place like this, panic was a confession. Julian didn't yank her closer, didn't raise his voice, didn't demand attention. He simply held her there like a page he wasn't finished reading. He leaned slightly toward her, the way men with power do when they want the world to keep spinning while their own private weather changes. "You don't write something like that for fun," he said, his voice low enough to live between the candlelight and the linen. His eyes moved over her face, the way a judge reads a witness, searching for cracks, for motives, for the familiar greed he'd likely seen 1,000 times. Emma could feel the heat of embarrassment crawling up her neck, not because she was ashamed, but because she understood what he assumed about her, that a waitress could only be brave if she wanted something. She swallowed, tasting fear like metal, and let the truth settle in her mouth before she released it. "I saw someone touch your glass," she whispered, keeping her lips barely moving, as if the words themselves might trigger the trap. "Not a waiter. Not a guest who belonged at your table." She tried to angle her eyes without turning her head, letting him follow the direction of her attention toward the service corridor, where staff entered and exited like shadows. In the warm glow, everything looked beautiful, but Emma's mind was suddenly sharp enough to notice the uglier details: an assistant's smile that didn't reach her eyes, a security guard watching the wrong doorway, a server who avoided Emma's gaze as if eye contact could turn into guilt. The room wasn't loud anymore. It was carefully noisy, like a blanket thrown over something that could still kick. Julian's grip eased, just enough to remind her he could let go, but also enough to remind her he had chosen not to. His gaze flicked across the tables with a predator's patience, measuring people the way he measured numbers, quietly, accurately, without sentiment. He made a small motion with his free hand, and a man in a dark suit near the bar shifted position, no longer part of the decor, but part of a plan. Emma realized then that Julian Hart was not panicking. He was collecting the room piece by piece, like a chessboard he intended to flip at the right moment. Yet beneath the control, she saw something else, an old instinct, the kind that wakes when a person finally realizes the danger isn't outside the gates, but already in the house. Emma's mind tried to run ahead to safety, to her tiny apartment, to her mother dozing in front of a muted television, to the familiar smell of laundry soap and cheap coffee. She could almost hear her mother's voice telling her to keep her head down, to let wealthy storms pass without stepping into them, because storms always hit the poor hardest. But Emma had watched too many small humiliations become lifelong losses, watched people swallow truth because truth was inconvenient, watched accidents happen to those who didn't belong. If she walked away now, the note would become a cruel joke she played on a stranger, and her courage would rot into shame. So she stayed, steadying her breath, letting the fear burn without letting it show. Julian released her wrist at last, but his eyes didn't release her, and that felt almost worse, like being kept on a leash made of attention. He placed the folded note inside his jacket as if it were a legal document, then lifted his glass again without drinking, holding it up like a man participating in the party while quietly refusing to join it. A smile passed across one side of his mouth, thin, controlled, not warm enough to be comfort, but sharp enough to be a warning to someone who might be watching. In that same breath, Emma noticed the entrance staff shift, subtle and coordinated, and heard the soft click that sounded too much like finality for a holiday night. The doors were locked now, and whatever Emma had seen was no longer only Julian Hart's problem. Emma moved through the dining room as if her shoes had suddenly become too loud, every step a risk, every breath something she had to borrow. Julian's quiet control had changed the air. Nothing looked different, yet everything felt watched, measured, and waiting. She kept her smile in place for the guests who demanded it, but her mind had already slipped away from the glittering tables and into the places she didn't like to visit. Memories that had taught her what power could do when it decided someone was disposable. The garlands above the bar seemed to droop heavier, as if even the decorations knew the night was no longer a celebration. And beneath the gold light, Emma felt the old truth return. In rooms like this, the people who serve are expected to be blind. Not long ago, she had believed that if she worked hard enough, life would eventually soften. She'd pictured stability in small, simple images. Her mother laughing, without worrying about the next bill, a fridge that wasn't half empty by the end of the week, a quiet morning where the mail didn't feel like a threat. She remembered the first time she wore this uniform, smoothing the fabric with careful hands, telling herself it was temporary, just a bridge between struggle and something better. Even the restaurant's luxury had felt like a strange kind of hope, as if being close to wealth could somehow warm her, but proximity to comfort had never been the same as belonging, and she'd learned that lesson in slow, humiliating ways. Still, she had stayed, because staying was what responsible people did when they didn't have anyone to rescue them. Her father's collapse had been the moment the world shrank. It happened in a hospital hallway that smelled like antiseptic and exhaustion, under lights too bright to let anyone hide from reality. One week he was making jokes at the kitchen table, promising that the chest pain was just age catching up, and the next week Emma was signing paperwork she barely understood while her mother stared at a wall like it might give answers. The doctors spoke in careful tones, and the bills arrived in brutal ones, stacking higher than any family could climb without help. Emma remembered the name on the denial letter that followed, an insurance decision, a corporate policy change, a signature that made the difference between time and goodbye. She didn't know then that companies could sound so polite while they took something sacred. She only knew that her father's eyes had looked smaller each day, and that her mother's hands had started trembling in quiet moments when she thought no one was watching. Tonight, that same old wound began to ache in a new way, and Emma didn't understand why until she saw it. A man at one of the nearby tables lifted his hand to adjust a cuff, and the motion was casual, almost graceful, like someone used to being served, used to being safe. On his finger was a signet ring, dark metal, a polished crest, a shape Emma recognized with a sudden sick certainty. She had seen it before, stamped on letterhead, embossed on a folder a hospital administrator held like it was holy, printed on a document that decided her father's care was no longer covered. For a heartbeat, the restaurant fell away, and Emma was back in that hallway, hearing the word policy spoken like it was destiny. She forced herself to keep walking, but her skin prickled as if the past had just reached out and touched her shoulder. The man laughed at something his companion said, and the sound was pleasant, normal, exactly the kind of normal that made harm so easy to hide. Emma's tray felt heavier as she turned, her gaze flicking toward Julian's section again, and she realized the danger might not only be about poison and betrayal tonight. The man with the ring sat among the guests who greeted Julian with warm smiles and practiced admiration, as if loyalty could be worn like a tie. Emma's mind connected the lines she'd never wanted to connect. Her father's ruin, that emblem, Julian's empire, and the way certain people never faced consequences because they called their choices business. Her stomach tightened as she understood what it meant. Someone tied to her family's pain wasn't a ghost from her past, but a living presence in this room, close enough to toast and smile and destroy. She looked at the ring again, then at Julian's controlled posture, and the thought landed in her chest like a stone. The threat wasn't just inside Julian's empire. It had been there all along, and it had already touched her life once. Julian didn't summon Emma like a man asking for help. He redirected her like a man rearranging the room. When she passed his table again, he rose with a calm that felt unnatural, spoke a soft sentence to the guests beside him, and then stepped away as if he were simply checking on the kitchen. Emma followed at a measured distance, heart thudding, hands steady only because she forced them to be. They slipped behind a velvet curtain and into a private corridor, where the air smelled faintly of pine and expensive cologne, where wreaths hung like polite disguises over security cameras tucked into corners. The hallway was lined with portraits. Older men in oil paint, stern women in pearls, faces that looked like they'd never apologized for anything in their lives. Emma had walked past that corridor 100 times without being allowed to enter it, and now she felt the weight of what it meant to be invited into the building's hidden spine. Julian's footsteps were unhurried, but the angle of his shoulders said he was listening for every sound behind them. He didn't glance back to check if she was still there. He assumed she was, because people like him were used to being followed. Emma noticed how the holiday decorations grew thinner back here, like cheer was reserved for the customers and caution for everyone else. He led her into a quiet lounge that looked like a room built to win arguments. Soft leather chairs, a low fire behind glass, a bar stocked with bottles nobody in her neighborhood could pronounce. Julian gestured for her to stand near the doorway, a position that felt less like courtesy and more like strategy. "Tell me exactly what you saw," he said, and there was no warmth in it, but there was something else, a demand for precision, as if truth could be measured the way prophets were. Emma told him about the hand on the glass, the timing, the service corridor, the way certain eyes avoided hers, and she mentioned the signet ring without yet explaining why it mattered. Julian's expression didn't change, yet Emma could feel him processing it all, filing each detail into a mental ledger where danger had its own column. Then he made 2 calls, quick and quiet, like a man ordering pieces onto a board. The first person to arrive was his head of security, a broad-shouldered man named Royce, with a gaze that swept corners before it settled on faces. The second was a woman in a charcoal dress and pearl earrings, who moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had cleaned up 100 disasters without ever letting her hair fall out of place. "This is Maren," Julian said, and the way he said her name carried a trust that made Emma's stomach tighten. Maren looked Emma up and down, not unkindly, but with the cool focus of someone deciding whether a stranger is a risk or a resource. Emma realized with a sudden hollow feeling that she wasn't in a lounge anymore. She was in the center of a quiet machine that could protect her or crush her without raising its voice. Julian stepped to the bar, opened a small wooden box that sat behind the bottles, and removed a neatly wrapped gift with a ribbon too perfect to be casual. "This arrived earlier," he said, setting it on the table between them like evidence, not celebration. Emma stared at the tag and felt her breath catch because it wasn't addressed to Julian Hart, it was addressed to Jay, as if the sender knew him intimately enough to shorten his name. Julian didn't open it yet, but he watched Emma as if her reaction might tell him something he couldn't afford to miss, and in that watching, she understood the true shape of the threat. Whoever wanted him dead wasn't outside these walls, begging to get in. They were already close enough to give him a Christmas present and close enough to smile while they waited. Emma returned to the dining room with her shoulders set in the practiced posture of someone who had learned how to disappear while still doing her job well. The music was brighter here, the laughter louder, and the warm lights made the world look softer than it truly was. But Emma felt as if she had stepped back onto a stage where every smile could be used against her. She carried a tray as if it were an alibi, keeping her movements steady, letting her eyes do the frantic work her face was forbidden to show. In the corner of her vision, she caught Julian taking his seat again, calm enough to make the danger seem like a private thought, and for a brief, terrifying moment she wondered if he had brought her into his plan only to keep her close, so she couldn't run. The manager intercepted her near the service station with a grin that was all teeth and no warmth, the kind of grin reserved for employees who were about to be reminded they were replaceable. His voice stayed polite, but his words carried a sharp edge. The VIP area had felt a disruption, and disruptions cost money, and money was the only language the building truly spoke. Emma tried to answer with calm professionalism, yet she saw how quickly suspicion gathered around her like smoke, helped along by a hostess whispering too much and a bartender glancing away too fast. In places like this, rumors didn't crawl. They sprinted, fueled by the assumption that a waitress must have done something wrong to be noticed at all. The manager leaned closer, lowering his voice as if he were doing her a favor, and warned her to keep her head down before she embarrassed herself further. Emma nodded, swallowing the sting, because defending herself would only confirm their favorite story, that she was trouble. She went back to the VIP section under the weight of that humiliation, and what hurt most was the loneliness of it. Julian hadn't spoken up, hadn't waved a hand to silence the manager, hadn't offered the simple shield that men like him could provide with a glance. Instead, he watched from a distance, his expression unreadable, and Emma felt the bitter confusion of being both used and ignored at the same time. She reminded herself that he was not her protector, not her friend, not anyone who owed her kindness, yet her chest still tightened with disappointment. It was a strange thing to risk your safety for a stranger and then be treated like a suspect for having a conscience. Still, she kept moving, because if she stopped, fear would finally catch her. When she reached Julian's table again, she forced her eyes to focus on the small, ordinary details that could hide a catastrophe. The candlelight flickered against the rim of his glass, and Emma noticed something that made her stomach turn. A faint smudge at the base, not from his fingers, but from someone else's careful touch. The glass had been shifted slightly from where she remembered placing it, too neat to be an accident, too intentional to be ignored. She watched the staff traffic in her peripheral vision, counting patterns the way a desperate person counts exits in a burning room. One server took a route that didn't match the usual flow, slipping toward the service corridor and returning with nothing in his hands, as if the errand itself was the purpose. Emma's pulse jumped as she realized the restaurant was not simply hosting a party, it was hosting a plan. She lowered a plate, adjusted a napkin, and used the smallest movements to scan the edges of the room because danger rarely announced itself in the center. The staff corridors were supposed to be controlled spaces, but now she could feel how porous, controlled really was when someone had the right badge, the right authority, the right smile. Emma saw a door crack open that should have stayed shut, and a sliver of shadow slide through like a secret being passed hand to hand. She thought of the manager's warning, of the rumor twisting her name into something ugly, and she understood how easily she could be framed if the night went wrong. If Julian died, she would become the simplest explanation, an invisible girl, made suddenly visible for all the worst reasons. And as she turned, carrying her tray like a shield, she realized with cold clarity that whoever was behind this didn't just have access to Julian's table. They had access to the places only staff were supposed to know. Julian Hart didn't leave because leaving would mean admitting he could be touched, and in his world, being touched was the first step toward being torn apart. He sat back down with the same controlled posture, the same calm hands, as if he were simply enduring a long toast instead of standing in the center of a quiet attempt on his life. Emma watched him from the edge of the VIP section and understood something uncomfortable. He wasn't just stubborn, he was proud in a way that had kept him alive for years. Pride for Julian was armor, and armor was hard to remove even when it started to suffocate. Yet Emma could feel how that armor made the room more dangerous because it forced the threat to adapt rather than retreat. Behind the scenes, the night became a subtle war of tiny changes that only the staff could notice. Royce repositioned guards with practiced neutrality, placing one by a hallway mirror and another near the kitchen door, making it look like routine while quietly tightening the net. Marin began checking details in a way that sounded harmless, but her questions landed like needles. Who handled the glassware? Who approved the service routes? Who had been in the back corridor after the gift arrived? Emma, still wearing her apron like a target, was given a new instruction. Keep serving, keep listening, keep breathing as if nothing had changed. It was a cruel kind of assignment, because it asked her to stand in plain sight while everyone else hid behind titles and earpieces. Still, she agreed, because she had already crossed the line and there was no clean way back. As Emma carried a tray toward the kitchen, she felt the room pressing against her in ways it hadn't before, as if the chandeliers themselves were watching. She could hear Christmas carols, but the notes sounded thin now, stretched over something darker, like decorations hung over a crack in the wall. The guests were warm and bright on the surface, smiles, compliments, expensive laughter. Yet Emma saw how quickly their eyes slid away from anything that threatened the fantasy. She passed the table where the man with the signet ring sat, and his laughter came too easily, too smoothly, like someone who had never been made to pay for a consequence. Emma's fingers tightened around the tray, not from anger alone, but from the feeling that the past and the present were holding hands behind her back. In the kitchen, where the heat made everyone impatient and the noise made secrets easier to hide, Emma heard something that didn't belong to a holiday rush. Two staff members spoke in low tones near the storage shelves, and one of them used a phrase that sounded like nonsense to anyone else. Something about switching the pour and keeping it clean. They went silent when Emma stepped closer, and the silence felt too quick, too rehearsed, like a curtain dropping. Emma forced a light comment, pretended she was just another tired waitress, and walked away with her pulse pounding. She didn't know the full meaning of what she'd heard, but she knew enough to feel the shape of coordination, and coordination was never an accident. For the first time she understood that the plan wasn't only about Julian's glass, it was about controlling the story afterward. When she returned to the dining room, she caught Julian's eyes for a brief, steady moment, and she could see the same conclusion forming in him. Someone intended to make her the easiest explanation if anything went wrong. Emma felt the sting of that possibility like a slap she couldn't show on her face, because she had spent her whole life being blamed for things she didn't cause simply because she was the lowest person in the room. Julian's pride kept him seated, but his gaze sharpened, as if he were finally willing to admit the traitor might be closer than he wanted to believe. Emma leaned in just enough to whisper what she'd overheard, and Julian's expression didn't change. Only the quiet tension in his jaw did. Then, somewhere behind them, a server appeared at the edge of the VIP section with a fresh tray and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and Emma realized the night had reached the point where she might be the problem they planned to erase. The collapse began with something so small it almost looked like routine. A dessert fork went missing, then a signed receipt, then a sealed envelope meant for the VIP table. Tiny objects that, in a restaurant this polished, carried the weight of scandal. Emma felt the shift before anyone spoke her name, the way the air changes when a room decides who it wants to blame. The manager's smile returned, sharper now, and a hostess leaned in to whisper with the urgency of someone sharing entertainment, not truth. In the glow of Christmas lights, the lie took shape as easily as a ribbon tied around a box. "Emma," the manager called, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, soft enough to pretend it wasn't cruelty. He asked her to step aside, and the way he said it made it sound like she'd already agreed to be guilty. Two security guards appeared, not rushing, not angry, just certain, like they'd been waiting for their cue all night. Guests glanced over and then quickly looked away, as if witnessing a worker's humiliation might stain their holiday. Emma tried to speak, but the words tangled with panic, and the manager used her hesitation like proof, listing complaints and concerns with the smooth confidence of a man reading from a script. She looked toward Julian instinctively, desperately, expecting him, just once, to use his power for something human. For a brief second his eyes met hers, and she saw something complicated there, not indifference, but calculation, the kind that chooses timing over tenderness. He didn't stand. He didn't point at the real threat. His gaze slid past Emma, toward the tables, toward faces, toward the man with the signet ring and the polished smiles that belonged to people who never lost. And in that instant, Emma understood the cruel genius of the trap. If he defended her too quickly, whoever was watching would know the warning had landed, and the real hand behind it would vanish into the crowd. Security guided Emma toward the corridor, and the humiliation followed her like a shadow that wouldn't let go. The manager spoke about policy and theft and calling the police, words that sounded official enough to frighten her into silence. Emma's cheeks burned, not because she was ashamed of herself, but because she could feel the room rewriting her into something ugly. A greedy waitress, a disruptor, a convenient villain in a wealthy person's story. She thought of her mother waiting at home, trusting Emma to keep the fragile stability they had, and the thought made her stomach twist with a fear that felt older than tonight. This wasn't just about losing a job. It was about being erased and replaced without anyone caring enough to ask what really happened. Then, through the doorway's narrow view back into the dining room, Emma saw Julian lift his glass again. He did it casually, almost lazily, like a man tired of listening to speeches, and for half a heartbeat she thought he was pretending, playing along to buy time. The rim touched his lips, and he took the smallest sip. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would alarm the room, just enough to satisfy anyone watching that the plan had reached its mark. Emma's breath stopped, as if her body knew before her mind could accept it, and the candlelight on his face shifted in an instant, fading from warm gold to something pale and wrong. Across the table, his hand tightened against the linen, his knuckles whitening, and as his eyes lifted, sharp, startled, suddenly human, Emma realized the night had just crossed the point where anyone could undo what was set in motion. Emma was pushed out into the cold, with the kind of finality that feels polite only because it's quiet, and the doors behind her closed as if the building itself had decided she no longer belonged to the story. Snow drifted under the streetlights like falling ash, beautiful from a distance and cruel when it settled on your skin, and her breath came out in sharp, uneven clouds. She stood on the sidewalk, clutching her coat tighter, listening to the muffled glow of the restaurant's music through the glass, as if joy could be sealed inside and sold by the hour. For a moment she couldn't move, because moving meant accepting that she had just lost her job, her safety, and maybe her future, in the span of one glittering dinner course. And yet what haunted her most wasn't the manager's accusations. It was Julian's face, paling in real time, as if the room had drained him like a slow, invisible theft. She made it to her car on instincts alone, fingers trembling as she fumbled for the keys, and when she finally sat behind the wheel, the silence hit her harder than any shouting could have. The steering wheel felt cold enough to sting, and the dashboard lights cast a cheap, tired glow across her hands, hands that had spent the night carrying luxury like it weighed nothing. She tried to steady her breathing the way she always did when life started closing in, counting seconds, swallowing panic, pretending that control was something you could summon if you wanted it badly enough. But the images kept returning. The locked doors, the whispering staff, the neat cruelty of a rumor forming, and that single sip that had changed everything. Emma pressed her forehead to the wheel, and for the first time all night she let herself admit, in the privacy of her own car, that she was terrified. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mother. Something simple, something gentle, asking if she was on her way home and reminding her that there was soup on the stove. Emma stared at the screen until her eyes blurred, because that small domestic kindness suddenly felt like the only safe thing left in the world. She thought of the rent, the bills, the fragile balance she'd been holding up like a ceiling with bare hands, and the shame rose hot in her throat, the shame of failing at the one job she needed to keep. Then she thought of Julian again, the man she had once assumed was made of stone, and she felt a strange twist of guilt, as if she had brought danger to him by naming it out loud. It would have been easier to believe she was wrong, easier to drive home and let the night fade into a bad memory. But her instincts, the ones sharpened by years of being overlooked, told her this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a plan. Emma had grown up around people who prayed not because they were perfect, but because they were exhausted, and she found herself doing the same thing now without even meaning to. Not a loud prayer, not a performance, just a quiet plea under her breath, the kind you offer when you have no leverage left. She asked for her mother's safety, for her own, for the strength not to be swallowed by fear, and then, against every reasonable instinct, she asked for Julian Hart's life to be spared, because death was still death no matter how rich the body was. In the distance, she could see the restaurant's lights shimmering through snow, warm and inviting like a lie, and she imagined the guests still laughing, still toasting, still pretending the world didn't have sharp edges. Emma realized that invisibility had always been her armor, but tonight it had also become her prison. And she understood something else, something heavier. If Julian died, she would not only lose her job, she would become the story they told to protect themselves. She started the car, but she didn't drive away right away, because leaving felt like surrendering the last thread of truth she still held. Her hands rested on the wheel, and she listened to the engine idle, a low, steady sound that reminded her that some things could still run even when the world felt broken. She told herself she owed Julian nothing, that powerful men survived on their own, that this was not her responsibility to carry. Yet her conscience refused to sit quietly, and the memory of his sudden human shock kept tugging at her like a child's hand. Emma wiped her cheeks, took a slow breath, and made a decision that felt like stepping back into a fire after you've already been burned. Then she put the car in gear, not toward home, but toward the truth, because she couldn't let a man die simply because the world expected her to stay invisible. Emma didn't return through the front doors, because the front doors belonged to people who could afford to be seen. She parked a block away and walked back through the falling snow, keeping her head down the way she'd always been trained to do, only now she was doing it with purpose instead of shame. The restaurant glowed like a jeweled box against the night, beautiful and sealed, and she hated how easily beauty could hide danger. Her hands were cold inside her pockets, but her mind was sharper than it had been all evening, fixed on one thought: if she had no power, then she needed proof. Instinct could save you once. Proof could save you twice. Behind the building, near the service entrance that always smelled faintly of grease and bleach, she saw a familiar figure hunched in a coat too thin for winter. It was Harold, the older busboy who moved quietly through every shift as if he were part of the furniture, the kind of man most guests never noticed, even when he refilled their water. He looked up when he heard her steps, and his eyes held the tired steadiness of someone who had watched rich people behave badly for too many years to be surprised anymore. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured, but there was no scolding in it, only concern, the kind that doesn't have time to dress itself up. Emma told him what had happened, her words tumbling out in low, urgent pieces, and Harold's face tightened as if he already knew the shape of the danger before she finished speaking. Then he nodded once, as if deciding something heavy, and said, "I saw it too, and I know where the cameras are supposed to be looking." He led her to a narrow side corridor where the hum of machinery covered their voices, and he pointed to a small dome camera tucked near a garland that had been placed just wrong, like decoration used as camouflage. "There's an angle," Harold said, "one that catches the corridor by the bar and the service pass through." Emma's heart lifted and broke at the same time, because hope always arrived with conditions. Harold explained that the footage was controlled through a system only a few people could access: management, security, and anyone with the right executive clearance. "And tonight," he added quietly, "someone has been in that system more than once." Emma stared at him, realizing this man had been listening all night, noticing details because invisibility had made him observant, just like her. For the first time since the manager humiliated her, Emma felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the heaters inside the building. She wasn't alone. Harold made a call on an old phone with a cracked screen, speaking softly as if the walls had ears, and within minutes a woman arrived from a nearby staff lot, her posture cautious, her gaze trained to measure exits. She was Nora, a retired detective who now worked occasional private security consulting for high-profile events, and she didn't waste words the way frightened people did. Emma expected doubt, but Nora's questions were precise, humane, and fast. What Emma saw, when it happened, who handled the glassware, who pulled her off the floor, who had access to back corridors. When Emma mentioned the signet ring and the name on the hospital papers, Nora's eyes narrowed, not with drama, but with recognition. "Patterns," Nora said simply, as if the word could hold 1,000 ugly stories. She told Emma that edited footage was often more revealing than clear footage, because editing left fingerprints, and fingerprints could be followed. They didn't have the luxury of breaking into systems or making bold moves. They had to move like people who understood the cost of being wrong. Nora mapped out a small plan with Harold's help. Find the nearest monitor station, confirm whether the feed had been altered, then force the truth into a place where it could no longer be buried. Before they separated, Harold hesitated as if weighing whether he should speak, and when he did, his voice was barely louder than the snowfall. "They've been whispering a name in the kitchen," he said, eyes fixed on the lit windows above them. "Not Julian's. Another one. Someone they talk about like he owns the night." Emma felt her stomach tighten again, because names were never just names in rooms like this. They were doors, and doors led somewhere dark. And as she followed Nora toward the side entrance, the hope she'd found took on a new edge. If she was right, the person behind it all was close enough to smile, close enough to toast, and close enough to decide that Emma needed to disappear next. The party reached its glittering peak, as if the building were determined to drown any hint of danger in gold light and expensive laughter. Snow kept falling outside, softening the city into something almost innocent, while inside the restaurant the chandeliers scattered warmth over faces trained to look untroubled. Emma returned through the side entrance with Nora and Harold's directions ringing in her ears, moving as quietly as a person can move when every hallway feels like it has memory. The music swelled, and a toast rose from the center of the room, and for a moment it seemed impossible that death could fit into a night so decorated. But Emma had learned that polished rooms were often the best hiding places, because no one wanted to be the one to ruin the picture. Julian Hart was still seated when she caught sight of him again, his posture steady, but his eyes sharpened by whatever had surged through his body minutes earlier. He didn't look like a man who had been saved. He looked like a man who had been warned that the ground beneath him could open at any time. Royce hovered nearby with a calm that felt trained, and Marin moved in and out of conversations the way a needle moves through fabric, stitching control back into the scene. When Julian's gaze found Emma, it held a brief flash of recognition, less apology, more urgency, as if he understood that her silence had become part of his survival. He didn't call her over. He simply made a small adjustment to his glassware, a signal so subtle it could pass as habit. Emma realized then that Julian's pride had shifted into something else, a quiet determination to catch the hand that had dared to touch him. Nora's plan was not dramatic, and that was what made it dangerous in the right way. Julian would stay visible, but the patterns around him would change. Service routes redirected, trays switched, timing altered, so the person behind the plan would have to reveal themselves by reacting. Emma slipped into the staff corridors like a shadow, no longer just moving through them, but reading them, noticing which doors opened too often, which faces turned away too quickly, which footsteps sounded heavier with purpose. The holiday decor back here was thinner, almost absent, and the bare walls made every whisper feel louder. Harold guided her to a small monitoring station where a guard pretended not to listen, while Nora checked the feed with the cool patience of someone who had spent years watching lies try to look like truth. Even before they found the proof, Emma felt it in her bones. Someone had designed the night like a story with a villain already chosen. When Emma returned to the floor, she saw a new gift box on Julian's chair, wrapped in paper so perfect it looked like it had been measured with a ruler. The ribbon sat at the exact center, not festive but precise, as if the giver wanted it noticed without ever being seen giving it. Julian's face did not change, yet his hand paused in the smallest way, and Emma understood how that kind of pause could scream inside a man who lived on control. Marin lifted the box with careful fingers, the way someone handles a snake that might be asleep, and placed it on the table as if it were a legal document. Inside, beneath tissue paper that smelled faintly of expensive perfume, was another note, shorter than the first but colder, written as if the writer felt no need to rush. It wasn't a warning this time. It was a promise. Emma didn't need to read every word to feel the weight of it, because the message carried the same cruel confidence she'd seen in the manager's eyes earlier, certainty that blame could be assigned and truth could be buried. Nora's jaw tightened as she studied the handwriting, and Harold's face went pale, as if he'd finally realized how high the stakes truly were. Julian lifted his gaze and scanned the room with a calm that looked almost serene, but Emma could see the storm behind it, the kind that doesn't break glass. It breaks people. Whoever was doing this wasn't panicking, wasn't improvising, wasn't even hiding with desperation. They were hiding with comfort, as if they believed the ending had already been decided. And as Emma watched the guests raise their glasses again, smiling and toasting beneath the Christmas lights, she felt a chilling certainty settle into her chest. The person waiting to finish the job was close enough to celebrate, because they were certain they had already won. Emma followed Nora back into the narrow corridor behind the kitchen, where the air was hotter, the walls were plain, and the world didn't bother pretending it was kind. A small monitor station sat tucked behind a frosted glass panel, its screens showing neat, silent angles of the restaurant, as if everything could be controlled by perspective. Nora didn't stare at the footage like someone looking for drama. She watched it like someone listening for a lie. Harold stood close, wringing his hands, while Emma felt her heartbeat thudding in her ears louder than the distant carols. In that cramped space, the party's sparkle felt far away, like a dream the building was having without them. Nora found the wound by noticing what wasn't there, the few seconds where the corridor camera should have shown a clean stretch of hallway, but instead jumped forward with a smoothness that was too perfect. "That's not a glitch," she said, her voice calm in a way that made Emma's stomach sink. "That's a cut." She tapped through the system logs, and names appeared like fingerprints, each one tied to permissions and access levels Emma had never imagined existed. Most were routine: security checks, management reviews, standard audits. Then one entry sat apart from the rest, stamped with a level of clearance that didn't belong to the building's staff at all. Nora's eyes hardened slightly, and she said the words that turned Emma's fear into something colder. Executive access. When Nora traced the account further, the trail didn't lead to a stranger with a stolen password, but to someone whose presence in Julian's life would explain the confidence in those notes. The system recognized the user like family, like leadership, like a person who could walk into Julian's world and never be asked to show a badge. Emma pictured the tables again, the polished smiles, the easy laughter, the signet ring catching candlelight like a quiet signature, and she felt the room reassemble itself in her mind as a theater of perfectly dressed threats. Out in the dining hall, Julian was still visible, still composed, playing his role with the steady patience of a man waiting for a trap to close. Back here, though, the truth was stripping the night down to its bones, and those bones belonged to someone who had been near him for a long time. Emma's phone buzzed, and for a split second her chest loosened, expecting her mother's gentle check-in, the small warmth of home. Instead, the screen showed a notification that didn't belong, an unfamiliar number, no name, no greeting, only a message that arrived like a blade sliding under a door. Nora leaned in, reading over Emma's shoulder, and Emma felt her fingertips go numb, as if her body were trying to refuse what her eyes were seeing. The message wasn't about Julian, not directly, not anymore. It was about Emma. About her place in this, as if someone had finally decided she was no longer invisible enough to ignore. "They're widening the circle," Nora murmured, and Harold went very still, like a man who suddenly understood how fast ordinary lives could be crushed. Then the second message came, and it carried a photo, Emma's mother's front steps, taken from the street at an angle that proved the photographer wasn't lost, wasn't passing by, wasn't guessing. Snow sat on the railing in the same uneven pattern Emma had seen that morning, and the porch light glowed in the familiar weak way that had always made their home look smaller but safe. Except now, a shadow was visible at the edge of the frame, just a hint of a figure too close to be accidental, too calm to be frightened. Emma's breath caught so sharply it felt like pain, because the threat had crossed the distance between a luxury restaurant and her real life without breaking a sweat. And beneath the photo, the final line appeared with the quiet certainty of someone who believed endings were theirs to choose. "Come back inside, Emma, or we finish this at your door." Emma's first instinct was to run to her mother's porch, run to the only place that still felt like hers. But Nora's steady hand closed gently over her phone, not to control her, but to keep her from reacting in a way the watchers could predict. "If they're sending photos, they want movement," Nora murmured, eyes scanning the hallway as if walls could carry whispers. Harold looked like he'd been punched by the thought of Emma's home being turned into a battlefield of fear, and Emma felt a hot, helpless anger rise under her ribs. She had spent years being small, so the world would leave her alone, and now the world had followed her anyway. In that tight corridor, with the party's music muffled like distant laughter, Emma realized she couldn't protect her mother by disappearing, because someone had already decided to find her. Julian listened without interrupting when Nora brought him the truth, and the restraint in his face was almost frightening, because it wasn't calm, it was discipline. He didn't explode, didn't shout, didn't demand names like a man in a movie. He simply absorbed the information the way he absorbed losses, and Emma saw something shift behind his eyes, like a door closing. "They want you scared," he said to Emma, voice low, not unkind but precise, as if fear were a tool he'd learned to recognize. He glanced toward the glittering dining room, the tables where smiles were traded like currency, and for a moment his gaze held a sadness that surprised her, brief, almost invisible, as if he already knew the traitor would be someone close enough to call him by a shortened name. Then he made a decision that felt like cold iron. The next course would be served as scheduled, but the night would no longer be allowed to pretend. If someone wanted to end him, Julian would force them to show their hand in front of witnesses who could no longer look away. Emma returned to the floor with her chin lifted and her hands steadying a tray, though inside her heart was pounding so hard she felt it in her fingertips. The dining room looked the same: candles, garlands, gentle music, silverware glinting like little promises. But to Emma, it now felt like a stage lit too brightly for the truth to hide comfortably. She moved among the guests again, close enough to hear fragments of conversation, and she noticed how the powerful spoke about morality, the way they spoke about wine, something to be sampled, not lived. At Julian's table, Royce stood at a distance that looked casual, while Maren hovered near the service path, her eyes reading faces the way other people read menus. Emma felt the weight of being visible again, and she understood the cruelty of it. If she stumbled, she would be blamed. If she didn't, she might still be erased. Then the antagonist finally stepped close, not with a mask or a threat, but with a smile that had been practiced in boardrooms and charity galas, smooth enough to pass as warmth. He spoke to Emma as if he were offering kindness, calling her dear, in a tone that reduced her to something decorative, and Emma felt the old humiliation rise, being spoken to like she was harmless, like she couldn't matter. His eyes flicked toward Julian's glass for the briefest moment, a glance so quick most people would miss it, and Emma's stomach clenched, because that glance carried ownership. "It's Christmas," he said softly, as if the holiday itself could excuse anything. "No one wants trouble tonight." The words were gentle, but the message underneath was sharp. Trouble would be made to disappear. Julian's voice cut through the softness like a door shutting, calm and unmistakably final, and every part of the room seemed to lean toward him without meaning to. He didn't accuse directly at first. He asked questions that sounded ordinary, about schedules, access, gifts and staff routes, each one polite enough to be harmless and precise enough to corner a lie. The smiling man answered too quickly, too smoothly, like someone who had rehearsed innocence, and Emma felt the air tighten as other faces began to sense that something real was happening beneath the ornaments. Nora's eyes stayed fixed on the antagonist, patient as stone, while Maren shifted position so subtly it could be mistaken for a hostess simply doing her job. Emma stood there with the tray balanced in her hands, realizing she was no longer just a witness. She was the hinge the whole night was swinging on. And as Julian finally let a single sentence land with quiet weight, enough to make the antagonist's smile falter, Emma understood the next truth waiting in the dark. Whatever was about to be revealed would demand a price, and someone would soon ask her to forgive what her heart was not ready to name. The room didn't explode into chaos the way movies pretend it does. It narrowed instead, as if every chandelier and every candle had leaned closer to hear the truth. Julian's questions stayed calm, almost courteous, but each one pressed into the same tender spot: who approved the camera access, who handled the gifts, who had the authority to alter security logs without triggering alarms. The antagonist kept smiling, kept offering polished answers, yet the smile began to look like something worn too long. Emma could feel it in the pauses between words, in the way certain guests stopped chewing, in the way even the pianist's hands softened on the keys. Nora stepped forward with a small tablet held low, not theatrically, and that quietness made it heavier than a shouted accusation. She didn't reveal everything at once. She revealed enough, timestamps that didn't match, an executive access entry that belonged to a name the room recognized, and the exact seconds that had been removed from the corridor feed. Royce added another piece with the same steady restraint, a list of who had been near Julian's table at the moments that mattered, and how those movements lined up with the edited footage like a signature. Murren, who had been silent all night, placed the 2 notes on the table in clear view, as if laying down a pair of gloves before a duel. The evidence didn't need to scream, it only needed to be undeniable. The antagonist tried to pivot, to turn it into a misunderstanding, then into a necessary correction, and finally into something almost righteous. Claims about protecting the company, about saving the legacy, about preventing Julian from ruining everything. And that was when Emma understood the real ugliness of it. The plan wasn't only about removing a man, it was about redirecting power, shifting control, rewriting who would inherit what, and calling it responsibility. The man's voice stayed gentle, but his eyes flashed with desperation, the kind that makes people justify anything if it means they get to survive on top. Emma watched the guests' expressions change one by one, some shocked, some relieved it wasn't them, some quietly disappointed the show wasn't prettier. She had never seen Wealth look so nervous, not because it felt guilt, but because it feared consequences. Julian listened until the last excuse ran out, then spoke with a steadiness that made the room feel suddenly adult, suddenly real. He didn't humiliate the man, didn't threaten him with violence, didn't turn the moment into revenge. He simply named what it was, calmly enough that no one could pretend it was a misunderstanding anymore. He instructed Royce to escort the antagonist out and place him into the hands of authorities waiting discreetly outside. And he did it with the same voice he might use to approve a contract, as if justice deserved professionalism, not theatre. Then Julian turned to the manager and the staff, and with a few precise sentences he cleared Emma's name in front of everyone who had watched her be blamed. Emma felt her knees threaten to weaken, because being believed after years of being overlooked can feel like a kind of shock. When the tension finally loosened, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like breathing again after being underwater. Emma stood at the edge of the VIP section, heart still racing, and realized the room was looking at her differently, not with admiration, not with pity, but with a small, uncomfortable recognition that she had been a person all along. Julian's gaze found hers, and for the first time there was something in it that wasn't calculation, something like regret and something like respect, quietly offered without spectacle. He stepped closer, not touching her this time, and spoke so only she could hear. "When the guests leave," he said, "I need to talk to you, just you and me, no one in between." The restaurant emptied slowly, like a tide pulling back from a shore that had just been reshaped. Plates disappeared, chairs were tucked in, and the holiday music softened into something almost embarrassed, as if it had played too loudly over a truth that deserved silence. Emma stood near the staff corridor with her coat in her arms, watching the last guests drift out with their perfect smiles, already rewriting the night into a story that would protect their comfort. Julian waited for her in the quiet lounge beyond the velvet curtain. No security between them now, no audience to impress, only the low crackle of a fire and the faint smell of pine. When Emma stepped inside, the world finally felt small enough for honesty to fit. Julian didn't start with explanations or power. He started with a sentence that sounded unfamiliar coming from a man like him. "I'm sorry," he said, and for a heartbeat, Emma almost didn't believe she'd heard it. He apologized for grabbing her wrist, for letting suspicion fall on her while he calculated, for treating her like a tool instead of a person when she had been the only one brave enough to act. Emma wanted to say that apologies didn't undo humiliation, didn't restore a job, didn't erase the image of her mother's porch on a stranger's phone. but she also felt the strange relief of being seen without being reduced. Julian's eyes didn't beg for forgiveness. They held steady, as if he understood that forgiveness was not a right, but a gift someone might choose or refuse. He offered to make things right in a way Emma had learned to distrust: money, protection, opportunity, the kind of help that often comes with invisible chains. Yet something about his tone was different now, less like a transaction, more like a responsibility he could no longer ignore. He told her he'd arranged security near her home for the night, and that Nora had already contacted local police to increase patrols, not as a spectacle, but as a quiet shield. He also said her job would be reinstated if she wanted it, or replaced with something better if she didn't: education support, a recommendation, a path that didn't keep her trapped under a manager's cruelty. Emma listened, arms wrapped around her coat, feeling anger and gratitude collide inside her like two weather fronts, because it was hard to accept help from a world that had harmed her so easily. When she finally went home, the apartment building looked the same: paint slightly chipped, hallway light flickering, a neighbor's Christmas wreath tilted to one side. But Emma's heart didn't settle until she saw her mother safe. Her mother opened the door with sleepy worry, turning quickly into alarm when she saw Emma's face, and for a long moment they simply held each other, as if warmth could undo what fear had threatened. Emma didn't tell her everything right away. She only said there had been trouble at work, that someone had tried to scare her, that it was handled now, and that she was sorry for being late on Christmas Eve. Her mother's hands trembled as she smoothed Emma's hair the way she had when Emma was a child, and whispered a simple truth that landed like a prayer. "You came back. That's what matters." But even in that quiet, Emma felt the shadow of the photo and the message, proof that safety could be watched, measured, and violated. The next morning, Julian arrived without fanfare, not in a parade of cars, but in a single vehicle that parked like any other, as if he was trying, awkwardly, sincerely, to step into Emma's world without making it about him. He stood in the hallway holding an envelope, his expensive coat dusted with snow, his expression tired in a way wealth couldn't hide. "This belongs to you," he said, and his voice held the weight of something he had carried too long. Emma stared at the front of the envelope and felt her breath tighten, because written there in careful letters was her father's name, as if the past had been waiting patiently for the right moment to speak. Julian placed it in her hands and met her eyes with a quiet admission he didn't fully say aloud: that his empire had touched her family before, and not by accident. And when Emma slid a trembling finger under the flap, she realized whatever was inside would change what she believed about him forever. Emma opened the envelope at her small kitchen table, the same table where her father used to drum his fingers while coffee brewed, and the paper inside felt older than the night that had just passed. It wasn't a check or a legal threat, but a letter, carefully typed, dated years ago, requesting an override for her father's treatment, signed by Julian Hart himself. Attached were notes, approvals that should have gone through, and a final page stamped "denied," followed by a name Emma now recognized from the restaurant, the same crest she'd seen on that signet ring. The truth landed softly, but it hit deep. Her family hadn't been forgotten. They had been blocked deliberately by someone who hid cruelty behind policy. Julian watched her read, not pleading, not defending himself, only letting the facts stand where excuses usually lived. "I built something too large," Julian said, his voice quieter than Emma expected, "and people learned to use it as a weapon, while I called it efficiency." He didn't ask her to absolve him. He acknowledged what his world had taken from hers, and that honesty, plain and unspectacular, felt like the first real apology Emma had ever received from power. He told her he had tried once, long ago, to intervene in a case that haunted him, But he hadn't fought hard enough when resistance came from inside, and he had let distance do what it always did, turn a person into paperwork. He admitted something else too, that last night, when he grabbed her wrist, he was not only afraid of dying, he was afraid of finally seeing how many lives his empire had brushed past without looking back. Emma's anger didn't vanish, but it found a place to breathe, because accountability, even late, was still different from denial. And for the first time, she understood that redemption wasn't a dramatic reversal. It was a long decision to become better. Christmas morning arrived with a soft light that made the apartment feel warmer than it was, and Emma's mother moved around the kitchen as if she were trying to stitch normalcy back together, one careful motion at a time. Julian didn't stay long. He left a number for Nora, a promise of continued protection, and a folder outlining concrete help that didn't depend on gratitude or silence, legal support, tuition options, and a formal statement clearing Emma's name with the restaurant and with the police report the manager had threatened. Before he went, he asked Emma one question that wasn't about him, what she wanted her life to look like if fear stopped choosing for her. Emma surprised herself by answering without hesitation, because something in her had shifted. She wanted stability that wasn't bought with humiliation, and dignity that didn't require invisibility. She didn't offer him forgiveness like a ribbon, and he didn't ask for it like a right, but there was a quiet understanding between them. The past could not be undone, yet the future could still be repaired. In the weeks that followed, the story didn't end in applause, but in steady work, which was the only kind of ending Emma truly trusted. Julian pressed charges where they were warranted, and he also built safeguards, audits, transparent oversight, and a fund dedicated to medical appeals so no family would be reduced to a stamped denial without a real human review. The restaurant manager was held accountable for his cruelty, and Harold, who had been invisible for years, was recognized and promoted for integrity that had quietly protected others. Emma enrolled in classes she had once assumed were for people like them, not for someone who used to count coins before buying milk, and her mother began to sleep more peacefully, as if her body finally believed they might be okay. Emma learned to set boundaries without guilt, to accept help without surrendering her voice, and to stand tall in rooms that once demanded she shrink. And Julian, humbled by how close death had come, started measuring his success less by what he owned and more by what he chose to make right. On the next Christmas Eve, Emma walked past the restaurant's glowing windows, not as a servant to other people's celebrations, but as a woman carrying her own quiet strength home. She still remembered the fear of that locked door and the sting of being blamed, yet she also remembered the moment she refused to look away, because that refusal had saved more than a life. It had exposed a truth that needed light. Some people in the world will always hide behind smiles and policies, but Emma learned that goodness doesn't need permission to exist, and courage doesn't require certainty to be real. In the end, the night that tried to erase her became the night that finally revealed her, and the empire that almost killed its own leader became an engine for repair because one overlooked waitress chose dignity over silence. If this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption.